Hello, everyone. Hello, class. This will be your first audio recorded lecture. We are at is it week 4? And so far we have sort of done an overview of emergent bilingual students um, and of language and its intersections with culture and identity and race and ethnicity and so on. As well as explored the racial dimensions of how we talk about these students and the kinds of schooling experiences that they have. That as a future teacher of emergent bilingual students, you need to be aware of. And based on our last conversation, it seems like folks in the class also want to be thinking about how to mitigate some of the oppressive circumstances these students will ultimately experience, maybe perhaps in your classroom and possibly at your school. So I just wanted to provide a little bit of an overview. Unfortunately, this isn't a give and take because I'm just recording myself, and hopefully you will ask questions in today's discussion, in the discussion post for this week, or in our conversations on Tuesday, our very short time together. So this is an overview. I'll be using the term bi-multilingual students, and the book, the book that you, the required book for the class uses the term emergent bilingual. No, emergent bilingual students. So I'll say what I use by multilingual. I use by multilingual because on the one hand, we are talking about students that are that speak at least one non-English language at home and as presumably as their first language, but we're also talking about students that are acquiring English as a second language. And so they're at a minimum they're bilingual, what we would consider bilingual in education. And yet we also want to think about these students as acquiring and developing a range of varieties within the two official languages. So for example, I speak Spanish and English, and so I'm bilingual, but I also speak varieties of Spanish and I also speak varieties of English. So it might be easier to consider that I speak, for example, academic English because of what I do and my training and my background, but that I also speak everyday English, probably Southern California English, and probably some variety that's reflective of Chicanos and Mexican Americans from California English. And everybody, by the way, speaks a variety. You speak a variety. Your family speaks a variety, and we acquire varieties throughout our lifetime, right? So I wasn't speaking academic English as a 7-year-old, but certainly now as a 48-year-old, I'm speaking. I certainly know how to speak at least that variety quite well. So I use the term by multilingual, and so the multi piece is speaking to the varieties and dialects and languages that students speak, and it's a very inclusive term. It's a very broad term, and so I will be going back and forth between bi multilingual as well as emergent bilingual. Sometimes I just say bilingual to kind of keep it simple, but those are my thoughts on why it helps to call them and think about these students as bi-multilingual. Also, as some of you said in class, some of the kids all actually might be trilingual or quadrilingual, right? I think we have a couple of trilinguals in this class. So there's a lot to say about a label. So I wanted to do a quick overview of the different labels just so that you're aware. And I think across your program, as you are trying to develop and articulate your professional identity and your philosophy of education, especially since you're acquiring an ESL certification, it's so important to, of course, you get to choose what label you want to use, but also it's really most important to have a rationale for that. And so, like I said, emergent bilinguals, and I'll be using the acronym EBs in this particular presentation, and it really does capture the fact that students that we think of as English learners or English language learners are in the process of becoming bilingual. You'll notice that in our culture, I think there's this idea that you can only call yourself bilingual if you've achieved a certain level of proficiency as determined by some sort of external kind of test or assessment or way to evaluate that. For example, I notice a lot of you in your introductions made it really clear that you don't consider yourself bilingual. And maybe that's true for some of you, but for some others of you, that it might be the case that you can converse and communicate very generally. And so if we took a kind of broader approach to what it means to be bilingual, and that maybe being bilingual means being able to engage in a conversation, informal as it may be, engage in a conversation across two languages or with two languages, then maybe some of you we might actually call you emergent bilinguals. And just like English learners are acquiring English as a second additional language, so too are a lot of you acquiring, possibly in the process of acquiring a second language. So you too might be in the process of becoming, and hence an emergent bilingual. So that's one label. That's the most common label that you'll see in the literature, for the most part, at least now. Also, by the way, I'm at home, and if you hear my daughter come in, I'll try to pause the recording. All right. So I already explained why I use bi-multilingual, but then I also use bilingual, and then some folks just use multilingual. It is really a matter of preference, and there is some people also use like plurilingual, which is a common phrase in Europe and Canada. So some of it depends on context and region. So the more formal term that came into existence under the No Child Left Behind Act of 2001 was English language learners, and some people just shorten it to English learners. And of course, the issue with this particular term, so let me actually, I'll go back. So this term was actually viewed as an improvement on the previous term, which was limited English proficient students. So of course, that was the term that was created post 1954, post desegregation, when all of a sudden kids that spoke English, who didn't speak English or didn't speak English very well, they had a right to be in public schools, and so the term that was assigned to those students were limited English proficient students. So of course you have the word limited already there lacking. I myself, as a kindergartner in 1977, was labeled a limited English proficient student, or sometimes they called us LEPs, LEP, LEPs. And so English language learners came into existence under the No Child Left Behind law. And so that one had been around for the last, I would say, like 15 years, until people started using emergent bilinguals. And sometimes they just shorten it as English learners, and sometimes they turn the ELL into Ls. So people will say students that are Ls, in other words, to students that are English language learners. But again, even the focus here is on the fact that they're learning English and not also developing their home language, but also that they're hopefully learning science and math and social studies, and learning to read and learning to write and learning poetry and music and art, etc. And so it's still kind of narrow of a term. Another term you might run into, maybe not so much in your program, but it's important to know that some people are using the phrase dual language learners or DLLs, and it's something that's referred to students that are in early childhood. So this term acknowledges that young children are still in the process of acquiring and developing their home language. And so really, if they're starting to learn a second language, let's say a kid speaks Hmong at home or Vietnamese at home, and they're early childhood, and they're in early childhood programs, they're probably 3 or 4 years old, maybe even 5. And so they're understood as still developing their home language, Vietnamese, but also acquiring a second language at the same time. So that's the term dual language learners. Then, so I had mentioned this, I probably should have put this one before English language learners, but this is the old LEP term. And then some people, we used to say language minority students or language minority communities to speak to not just the limited power that speakers of non-English languages and non-English speaking communities had, but also that they really were. There was a time when they were in the minority in different states and in the country, and now people are using the phrase speakers of minoritized languages or minoritized language speakers, because it acknowledges that there is power. Just because you're a minority doesn't mean you don't have that you can't exercise power or don't exercise power. So the notion of a minoritized language acknowledges that there is a power structure, there is a system making you a minority and silencing you and diminishing your voice and your agency, etc. And so that's another phrase. And so there's also informal labels, but I always like to remind students, especially since you're going to become future ESL teachers, the term ESL, which means English as a second language, of course, that label pertains to a program, not a student. So when we say you're getting your ESL certification, we're not saying you're getting a certification in students. You're getting a certification in the area of ESL, and you will be certified to teach in ESL programs. You might even call some classrooms ESL classrooms, but it definitely does not pertain to students at all. All the terms that you see before you above are the ones that pertain to actual little people, but not ESL. And some other nasty terms that have kind of crept up in the past and are not in much use, but it's good to know so that you have a consciousness about it if you do hear them. One term is semilinguals, and the word semi there is really emphasizing the fact that it's sort of a refusal to emphasize that they are bi or multilingual or plurilingual. In other words, that they have limited language in their home language, or limited abilities in their home language and limited abilities in their English language. So it's really important to understand that all humans speak a language. And so that when people use the word semilinguals, they really are talking from a place of a notion of, that being bilingual has to be assessed or evaluated in order for the term to be used. But that really emphasizes a deficit. And then there's this other really nasty word. I come from Southern California, and I have heard this word, non-nonce. It really is used by people, by educators, and it really does mean that you understand bilingual students, multilingual students as being insufficiently proficient in their home language and in their second language, or English in our case. So this really is, deficit in both ways. Again, all humans have the capacity to communicate even without language. And so, the idea that a student would be twice, be a non-linguistic person in two languages is really far-fetched. So this is a really negative way of describing students. But